Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're tackling a topic that, well, it often gets labeled as soft, doesn't it?
It really does.
But we're here to show you it's actually the bedrock of effective leadership, interpersonal and influence skills. This isn't just about being agreeable, it's about the core drivers that make leaders truly successful.
Absolutely. And for you, our listener who values gaining knowledge efficiently, thoroughly, this deep dive is really designed to extract the most critical insights from the research on these essential skills.
Yeah, getting right to it.
Our goal is basically give you a clear understanding of what these skills entail, why they are, frankly, increasingly vital, and how they can be developed in a practical way.
So our mission today is sort of threefold. First, to clearly define these so-called soft skills, which we'll be referring to more specifically as interpersonal and influence skills.
Good distinction.
Second, to really illustrate why they are more important than ever in today's leadership landscape. And third, to explore concrete ways in which these skills can be cultivated.
Right. And we've looked at a whole range of sources that offer different angles, from breaking down the components of these skills to analyzing their impact and, importantly, the strategies for learning them.
It's fascinating, actually, to look back at how leadership thinking even started. Those landmark studies out of Ohio State and Michigan back in the 1940s,
Yeah, the classics.
they gave us that foundational two-factor model, initiation, which was all about getting the task done,
Task performance, yeah.
and consideration, which covered the human element, those people skills. But for a long time, consideration was almost seen as secondary, wasn't it? Sort of less important than initiation.
Definitely. It was almost like if you were good at the technical stuff, the people skills would just sort of happen. Or maybe they didn't matter as much.
Which we now know isn't really the case.
Not at all.
You fast forward to more recent thinking, and there's a Harvard Business Review study, which is referenced in our materials, that really highlights this shift. They found, interestingly, that many people would actually rather work for a lovable fool,
Huh? Yeah, I remember that phrase.
someone maybe less technically brilliant but really good with people than a competent jerk.
And what's really fascinating about that finding is the implication. Being liked and having strong interpersonal skills can, in some situations, be valued even more than pure competence.
It's a powerful idea.
And organizations are increasingly recognizing this. They're actively trying to cultivate what they call lovable stars, people who are great at both. And, crucially, addressing situations where high competence comes at the cost of, well, negative interpersonal impact.
Exactly. So the key takeaway there seems to be that strong people skills can genuinely outweigh pure task performance in determining organizational success and, individual effectiveness.
But, and this is a big but as we dig in, one of the ongoing challenges is the lack of a single, agreed-upon framework for really understanding and developing these skills.
Right. It's not as straightforward as learning, say, a new piece of software.
Precisely. There's been a lot of discussion over the years around what to even call them you hear. Soft skills, conceptual skills, interpersonal skills, communication skills.
All sorts of labels.
Yeah, and the term interpersonal and influence skills seems to be gaining traction because it feels, perhaps, a bit more comprehensive as a descriptor.
Okay, that makes sense.
Yes, and in their work, Sean Pichler and Gerard Binnen, they directly address this very challenge. Their aim was really to create a more robust model and, importantly, a reliable way to measure what they specifically term managerial interpersonal skills, or PPACE.
In my case, okay.
The core insight of their work is this move towards defining and measuring managerial specific interpersonal skills, recognizing they might be distinct from just general social skills.
Okay, let's unpack their approach then. They start by noting that while, everyone pretty much agrees these skills are important for managers.
Especially when you consider that lovable fool idea.
Right. But despite that agreement, there hasn't been a strong consensus on exactly what these skills are for someone in a management role. What specific abilities do they encompass?
And it's quite interesting just how many different models and categories have been thrown around over the years. You've got models focusing on broad social skills, specific communication techniques, ways to manage conflict, even political savvy within the company.
A real mix.
A real mix. And Pichler and Bennen point out that despite all these ideas floating around, there hasn't been a properly validated tool specifically designed to measure interpersonal skills in a managerial context.
So without that clear definition and a way to assess them in managers, it's hard to really nail down their impact on leadership effectiveness.
Exactly. It becomes difficult to study systematically.
So how did Pichler and Benin try to bring more clarity to this? Our sources mention that Klein and his colleagues did this huge review first,
Yeah, quite an undertaking.
looking at, what, over 50 different frameworks, and they
Mhm.
found something like 400 individual skills that could be called interpersonal. 400.
It really highlights the complexity, doesn't it? Client and colleagues then tried to structure this, proposing a two-part structure. Communication was one main area.
Okay, like active listening, speaking clearly, nonverbal cues, that sort of thing.
Precisely. And the other main area was relationship development. That covered cooperation, social awareness, empathy, trust building, political awareness, networking. A lot packed in there.
So Klein's work kind of laid the groundwork by showing just how vast this area is.
It really underscored the need for more focused models, like what Pichler and Binnen were trying to build. So following this, Pichler and Binnen took a two-stage research approach to really try and pinpoint the key elements of MPS.
Right, 2 phases. What did phase 1 involve?
In the first stage, they did a thorough review of all the existing research, but they also gathered in-depth qualitative data. They actually interviewed managers. This initial work led them to propose a model with 4 main categories.
And those initial categories were, let me see, self-management, communication, social acumen, and influence.
That's right.
Self-management covering things like initiative, emotional control, self-awareness. Communication being, well, speaking and nonverbal stuff. Social acumen, more about reading emotions, building relationships, handling disagreements.
Good summary. And influence was about motivating people, coaching them, and kind of navigating the organizational politics side.
Okay.
And it's important to note here, Prischler and Bin explicitly connected that self-management piece to the idea of emotional intelligence, or EI.
Ah, EI comes in.
Yes. They reference Salovey and Mayer's definition, EI being the capacity to understand and manage emotions, both in yourself and in others, to guide your thinking and behavior. And research has pretty consistently shown a positive link between EI and, well, better social interactions at work, leader emergence, even task performance.
And you mentioned Salovey and Mayer's model. They break EI down further, don't they, into 4 parts?
They do. It's quite helpful. First, perceiving emotions accurately, just noticing them. Second, using emotions to actually help with thinking. Third, understanding emotional language and complex emotions. And fourth, and this is really crucial for interpersonal skills, managing emotions in ourselves and others.
That management piece seems key for interaction.
They emphasize that this aspect, emotion regulation, is particularly vital for social interaction because it directly shapes how we express our feelings and, crucially, how we behave in response to other people's feelings.
Okay, so that was phase 1. What happened in phase 2?
Then, Pichler and Benin moved to the second stage. Here, they actually developed and tested an initial version of their MIP scale. This involved creating a big pool of questions, over 100 items, based on their interviews and the existing research.
Testing it out.
Exactly. And this pilot testing ultimately led them to refine their model. They ended up with a more focused 3-factor model.
Ah, so it changed from 4 categories to 3. What were the final 3?
Supporting others, motivating others, and managing conflict.
Interesting. So communication isn't a separate category anymore.
Not as a standalone factor, but it's definitely woven throughout those 3 areas. For instance, items like actively listens to team members ended up loading on to the supporting dimension. And something like communicates clear goals and expectations fell under motivating others. So it's still very present.
Got it. It's embedded.
Precisely. And it's really crucial to understand their focus here. Pichler and Binnen were specifically looking at behavioral skills and competencies, things they believe can be developed through training and practice.
So less about fixed personality traits.
They were intentionally trying to differentiate these trainable skills from more stable personality traits, like someone's overall level of emotional intelligence or even their fundamental ethical character. Although they do acknowledge that those underlying traits can certainly influence how well someone uses these interpersonal skills.
They kind of set the stage for behavior.
In a way, yes. They even identified this concept of interpersonal ethics that came up in their interviews, suggesting there's a moral dimension to how managers interact with people, which is tied to, but distinct from, the behavioral skill itself.
Okay, that's a really helpful framework. Now, shifting our focus a bit, another really valuable perspective on these skills comes from Ronald Riggio and his social skills model.
Ah, yes, Riggio's work. Very influential.
The key insight from his model seems to be that effective people skills and leadership aren't just one thing, but rather a combination of, what is it, 6 distinct communication abilities?
That's right, 6 core skills, some focusing on expressing yourself and others on perceiving or understanding others.
What's particularly useful about Riggio's model, I think, is how it breaks these down so clearly. He identifies, let's see, emotional expressiveness, emotional sensitivity, emotional control.
Right, those are the emotional communication skills.
Then there's social expressiveness, social sensitivity, and social control.
Those are the social communication skills. Together, they form the full model.
Okay, let's quickly define those. Emotional expressiveness, that's showing your own feelings non-verbally.
Exactly. Your ability to convey emotion through face, tone, body language.
Emotional sensitivity, picking up on others' nonverbal cues.
Your decoding skill for others' emotions.
Emotional control, managing your own emotional displays.
Regulating your outward expression, yeah.
Then social expressiveness is more about verbal skill and engaging socially.
Your ability to talk, engage others in conversation, be outgoing verbally.
Social sensitivity, that's like listening well and knowing the social rules.
Understanding social norms, being a good listener, decoding verbal cues accurately.
And social control, being adaptable, tactful, sort of socially competent.
Yeah, like social role-playing ability, knowing how to present yourself effectively in different situations.
Eh.
Poise, tact. And Reggio developed a tool for this, didn't he? The social skills inventory.
He did the SSI. It's a self-report measure designed to assess these 6 skills.
Now, what makes this particularly relevant for our discussion today is how this model connects directly back to leadership effectiveness.
Right, like we mentioned with the early Michigan studies, the recognition that people skills are just as important as focusing on the task.
Absolutely. And Reggio's model helps us break down how these specific emotional communication skills actually play out in the leader-follower relationship.
So, for example, emotional expressiveness. That's been linked to things like charismatic leadership.
Consistently, yes. Leaders who are better at expressing emotions nonverbally are often perceived as more inspirational, more charismatic, and importantly, research suggests they can actually be more effective leaders overall.
Does it matter which emotions they express?
That's a good point. While expressing a range is important, there's evidence suggesting that expressing positive emotions, in particular, can have a really beneficial impact on team morale and performance.
That makes sense. It ties into that idea of emotional contagion.
Exactly. The leader's expressed emotions can kind of spread to the team. If a leader is genuinely positive and enthusiastic, that can be a powerful motivator.
Okay, and what about the social skills side? Social expressiveness and social control.
Riggio emphasizes those too. Social expressiveness being verbally engaging, and social control managing your social image. Effectively, he combines these into a concept called savoir-faire.
Savoir-faire, French for knowing how to act.
Pretty much. It's about having that social grace, that ability to navigate social situations smoothly and effectively, knowing what to say, how to act.
And how does that link to leadership?
Well, what's particularly interesting is some research found that this savoir-faire actually mediated the relationship between being an extrovert and having leadership potential.
Oh, meaning.
Meaning it suggests it's not just about being outgoing or extroverted per se, it's the skillful performance in social interactions, the savoir-faire, that really translates into being seen as an effective leader.
Ah, so it's not just the trait, it's the skill in using it.
Precisely. It's
Yeah.
about skilled social performance.
So how can leaders actually use Riggio's model for their own growth? Could they use the SSI?
Absolutely. The SSI has been used quite a bit over the past few decades as a diagnostic tool for leaders and managers.
How does that work?
Typically, an individual completes the self-report questionnaire, and then they receive detailed feedback on their relative strengths and weaknesses across those 6 communication skill areas.
Just based on their own view.
Often, yes, but sometimes it's combined with feedback from their team members or peers using modified versions to provide a more rounded perspective. It can be really revealing.
Can you give an example?
Sure. Imagine a manager who sees themselves as quite effective, but they consistently get feedback, maybe through the SSI or other means, that they score lower on the sensitivity scales, emotional and social sensitivity. And if this aligns with comments from their team about perhaps not being a very good listener or maybe seeming unaware of how people are feeling, that can be a real eye-opener. It provides a concrete area, okay, I need to work on my sensitivity, maybe practice active listening,
Yeah.
and becomes a motivator for development.
So it gives them specific targets.
Exactly. And Riggio and his colleagues have been working on developing a full 360-degree feedback version of the SSI to provide an even more comprehensive assessment from multiple perspectives.
That sounds really valuable. Let's now turn our attention specifically to emotional intelligence, EI, in the leadership space.
Okay?
Carrie Chernis and Richard Boyatzis offer a really insightful perspective here.
They certainly do.
And the key insight from their work, as I understand it, is the importance of focusing on developable competencies linked to EI rather than trying to somehow change deeper personality traits.
That's a great summary. What's particularly valuable is Boyatzis' multi-level theory of personality. It's a way of thinking about how different aspects of us are layered.
Layered? How so?
He proposes that our personality is structured in levels, deeper levels, like maybe our basic innate capacity for perceiving emotion that's likely more stable, harder to change significantly, especially as we get older.
Okay, the foundations.
Right. But when you look at the more surface levels, level 4, which he calls competencies, like how we typically act in certain situations, our habits of behavior, and level 5, skills, specific learned abilities, these are much more adaptable. They're more open to development through conscious effort.
Okay, so the implication here is that our real leverage for improving interpersonal effectiveness lies more in developing those outward-facing skills and competencies,
Exactly.
rather than trying to fundamentally rewire our underlying emotional hardware, so to speak.
That's a good way to put it. And this layered theory directly informs their more specific theory of how EI relates to performance. It shows how those core EI abilities, like perceiving emotions accurately, as defined by Mayer and Solovey.
The foundations again.
Yes. How those connect to broader emotional and social intelligence-based competencies, the behavioral patterns, and then how both of those ultimately influence our actual performance in leadership roles.
So it connects the dots from ability to behavior to outcome.
Right. It provides a really valuable framework for understanding the different levels at which EI operates and how they relate to each other.
They use empathy as a really good example to illustrate this multi-level idea. Can you walk us through that? How does empathy fit into these different layers?
Sure, it's a great illustration. So at the most fundamental level, level 1, you have neurological research suggesting specific brain regions are involved in the experience of empathy, the biological basis.
Okay, deep down.
Then moving up to level 2, you have the ability to accurately perceive nonverbal cues that indicate emotions. This is something that can be measured by tests like the MSCEI or the DANAV. It's about picking up the signals.
Still fairly fundamental ability.
Yes. Then at level 3, which they term operating philosophy or values, research has linked having, say, a more humanistic, people-centered approach to having stronger social competencies, like understanding others.
So your underlying values influence your potential here.
Exactly. Then at level 4, you get to things like self-report measures of EI, like the EQI. These assess how well individuals believe they understand others' feelings, their self-perceived empathy.
How they see themselves.
Right. And finally, at level 5, you have multi-rater assessments like the ESEI, the Emotional and Social Competency Inventory. These gather feedback from people who actually work with the individual, their boss, peers, direct reports, to assess their observable empathic behaviors in real-world situations. How do others see their empathy in action?
Ah, so from the biological roots all the way up to how others actually experience your empathy.
Precisely. It shows how a concept like empathy manifests at different levels of personality and behavior.
So this multi-level view must have pretty significant implications for how we approach leadership development, right?
Absolutely. The theory strongly suggests that when it comes to development interventions, our initial focus should probably be on those EI and SI competencies at levels 4 and 5, the self-perceptions, and especially the observed behaviors,
Way there specifically.
because they have the most direct, demonstrable link to actual leadership effectiveness. And crucially, they also offer the greatest potential for meaningful change through targeted effort, coaching, and practice. When people are actively working on development, they are primarily working on changing their behaviors.
Makes sense. You work on what you can most directly influence.
Exactly. And indeed, research that's reviewed effective EI training programs has consistently shown that the successful ones tend to focus on developing those observable behaviors, those competencies, rather than trying to somehow alter deeper personality traits or fundamental values.
And the MBA programs at the Weatherhead School of Management, they're often cited as a prime example of putting this into practice, aren't they? With their focus on competency-based development.
They really are. They have a core first-year course that's built around this. Students undergo really comprehensive assessments of their EI competencies. Using tools like the ESCI, they receive extensive feedback from multiple sources, self, peers, faculty, coaches.
A lot of data.
A lot of data. And then based on that, They develop detailed personal development plans, specifically targeting the competencies they want to grow.
Mm-hmm.
And longitudinal studies of this program have shown really significant and, importantly, lasting improvements in key EI competencies, things like initiative, flexibility, empathy, coaching, self-control among their MBA graduates compared to students in more traditional MBA programs.
And these improvements stick over time.
Yes, the research suggests these improvements persist well after graduation. It really highlights the power of a focused, competency-based approach that integrates assessment, feedback, planning, and practice.
That's compelling evidence. Now, let's switch gears slightly and turn our attention to something that often operates below the surface, but is incredibly powerful: nonverbal behavior in leadership. Anik Darili and Marianne Schmid-Mast have provided a valuable review here.
Yes, a fascinating area.
The key insight seems to be just how much of leadership perception and influence is actually communicated nonverbally without words.
It's striking, isn't it? How much information we convey and interpret without a single word being spoken. Our sources highlight that in those crucial initial encounters, the impressions we form are heavily influenced by both what is said and how it's said, all those nonverbal signals we consciously or unconsciously pick up on.
And those first impressions can really stick, right? Whether they're accurate or not.
They absolutely can. They set the tone for future interactions and can significantly color how we perceive that person going forward.
They bring in something called the Brunswickian lens model to help understand this. Can you unpack that a bit?
Sure. Think of it like this. A leader, the target, might try to project confidence through, say, upright posture and steady eye contact. That's the cue they're sending out.
Okay.
The lens is how that cue is interpreted by the perceiver, say a team member. Does the team member see confidence, or do they interpret that same posture and eye contact as arrogance or intimidation?
Ah, so the interpretation is key.
Exactly. The lens model helps illustrate how perceivers use these observable nonverbal cues, the lens, to make judgments about the target's underlying state or personality. And accurate social perception in leadership is partly about ensuring your nonverbal cues, the signals you send, are being interpreted through the lens in the way you intend them to be.
Making sure the message lands correctly.
Precisely. And Darili and Schmid-Mast define these nonverbal communication abilities as the skills we possess in both effectively sending nonverbal messages and accurately interpreting the nonverbal messages of others, as well as our ability to consciously control our own nonverbal displays when needed.
So encoding, decoding, and regulating nonverbal signals.
Right. And they emphasize that these abilities are a fundamental part of our broader interpersonal skill set. They're not separate. They're integral.
So in practical terms, how do leaders actually use nonverbal behavior to, say, exert influence or convey authority?
Oh, in numerous ways. For instance, leaders often use cues like maintaining appropriate eye contact, adopting an open and confident posture, using purposeful hand gestures, even vocal tone and pacing, to convey power, confidence, and authority. There's even research on nonverbal persuasiveness.
And does it work? Does it impact how they're seen?
Research consistently shows that a leader's nonverbal behavior significantly impacts how effective they are perceived to be. It influences ratings of their competence, follower satisfaction and motivation, and just general evaluations of their leadership quality.
It's not just about power, though, is it? What about trust and connection?
Absolutely critical. Building trust, fostering team cohesion, demonstrating sensitivity to the needs and feelings of followers, these are all heavily reliant on effective nonverbal communication. Things like mirroring posture, subtly, nodding, smiling appropriately, leaning in these signals convey warmth, attentiveness, and empathy.
So reading others' nonverbals is just as important.
Just as important. As our sources, including Reggio's work, point out, leaders who are adept at accurately reading and interpreting the nonverbal cues from their followers, noticing subtle shifts in expression or posture that might indicate confusion, disagreement, or concern, are much more likely to understand and meet their followers' needs.
And that leads to being seen as more effective.
Exactly. It builds rapport and trust, leading to more positive perceptions of their leadership effectiveness overall.
And this brings us back in a way to that concept of savoir-faire we discussed earlier,
Yes, it does.
where social expressiveness, the verbal engagement, combined with social control, managing your social image, that these are crucial for enacting the leadership role effectively. And that clearly extends to the nonverbal realm, too.
Precisely. The way a leader carries themselves, their facial expressions, their vocal qualities, even when they aren't speaking explicit words, all contribute powerfully to the overall message they're sending. It significantly influences how they are perceived and ultimately how effectively they can lead their teams. It's a constant broadcast.
A constant broadcast. I like that. Okay, let's now explore the often very complex domain of emotion management in leadership. Shane Connolly and colleagues offer a valuable conceptual framework here.
Yes, they tackle it head on.
And a key insight from their work seems to be the need for a more specific, more nuanced understanding of how these emotion management skills impact various different aspects of leadership performance, rather than just looking at broad EI.
That's right. And it's important to acknowledge up front, as they do, that there have been some valid criticisms raised about some of the current ways EI is conceptualized and measured.
Such as?
Well, some research has questioned whether broad EI measures truly provide unique insights into leadership effectiveness beyond what can already be explained by things like general intelligence, IQ, and the big five personality traits. Is EI adding distinct predictive power?
The value add question?
Exactly. So Connolly and his colleagues argue for a more focused lens. Let's look specifically at the skills involved in managing emotions effectively, both one's own and others. And let's look closely at how these skills relate to specific leadership outcomes, and also consider the various factors, individual differences, situational context that might influence these relationships.
So moving beyond a single score to look at specific capabilities in specific situations.
Precisely. It's a call for greater construct specificity. Let's be clearer about what we're measuring on the predictor side, the emotion management skills, and also consider the complex interplay between these skills, other factors, and different performance criteria. They highlight the potential of drawing from research in areas like emotion perception, the structure of emotion, emotion regulation strategies, emotional labor, and emotional expression.
Okay, so they advocate for more precision. How do they see these emotion management capabilities playing out in specific leadership domains? They mention conflict management, for example.
Yes, conflict is a prime example. In any conflict situation, leaders are obviously tasked with managing their own emotional responses, staying calm, avoiding defensiveness. But they also need to navigate and influence the emotions of their team members and maybe other parties involved.
Keeping things from escalating.
Exactly. Preventing conflict from spiraling often hinges on the overall emotional climate within the team, which the leader helps set, and the leader's ability to use specific emotion management skills effectively. This might involve de-escalating tense moments, maybe redirecting negative energy, perhaps using humor appropriately or finding distractions.
The team's emotional vibe matters too.
Definitely. Research indicates that the prevailing emotional climate of a team significantly influences how its members react to disagreements. Leaders with strong emotion management skills are better equipped to establish healthier norms and guidelines for how conflict should be surfaced, discussed, and resolved constructively within the team.
That makes a lot of sense. They also mention other areas where emotion management is crucial: risk assessment, decision making.
Yes, several key areas. In risk assessment, for instance, our emotional responses can significantly shape how we perceive and evaluate potential risks. There's the risk is feelings hypothesis. Sometimes our gut feeling about a risk differs from a purely rational calculation.
Emotion versus logic.
Right. And decisions driven primarily by strong emotions might sometimes lead to more risk-seeking behavior, or they might be more heavily influenced by the immediate pleasure or pain associated with an option, rather than long-term consequences. Particularly interpersonal risk assessment tends to be highly emotional.
And decision making more broadly.
Emotions provide valuable information for decision-making, but leaders need to be acutely aware of how both their own emotions and the anticipated or actual emotions of others are influencing the choices being made. Is fear driving a decision? Is over-optimism blinding us?
What about motivation?
Understanding and effectively responding to the emotional states of followers, recognizing frustration, acknowledging effort, celebrating successes authentically can be a really powerful lever for enhancing their engagement, commitment, and overall motivation.
It seems deeply intertwined with so many leadership functions: creativity, teamwork, stress management too.
Absolutely. Emotional states can influence creative thinking. Managing team emotions, cohesion, frustration, excitement is crucial for effective team processes. And of course, leaders need to manage their own stress and also help their followers manage theirs, which is a core emotion regulation task.
And Connolly and colleagues also touch upon individual differences that influence how well we manage emotions, like trait effect and empathy.
Yes. Our general tendency towards experiencing positive or negative moods, our baseline trait effect, can influence the kinds of emotion regulation strategies we naturally prefer or find easier to use.
And empathy, we talked about that earlier.
Empathy plays a huge role here too. The ability to understand and share the feelings of others seems closely linked with having better emotion management skills overall. Taking an empathetic perspective, really trying to see things from another's point of view, can significantly aid in both recognizing emotions accurately and regulating them effectively, both in ourselves and in our interactions with others. And empathy has been linked to both leadership emergence and performance.
So it's a key enabler for emotion management.
It certainly seems to be.
Okay, let's shift our focus now to a really compelling perspective on leader ethos or character, drawing from the work of Peter L. Jennings and Sean T. Hanna.
Yes, this brings in a distinctly moral dimension.
The key insight here, rooted interestingly in Aristotelian rhetoric, The Art of Persuasion, is that a leader's perceived character, their ethos, is absolutely fundamental for building credibility and trust.
And that credibility and trust are essential precursors for followers' willingness to actually follow, to commit not just out of obligation, but out of belief in the leader and the cause. Normative commitment.
What's crucial here, they argue, is that a leader's ethos isn't just some static personal attribute they possess in isolation. It's something that's actively constructed. It's shaped through the ongoing leadership process itself.
How so?
Through the leader's consistent actions and behaviors, what they call leader enactment, and critically, how those actions are interpreted and perceived by followers over time.
So leader enactment is like the public demonstration of character.
Exactly. It goes beyond just superficial behaviors or putting on a show. It's about how a leader's actions reveal their deeper moral qualities, their substantive character traits. Are they walking the talk?
And Jennings and Hanna highlight three core Aristotelian characteristics that they see as vital for demonstrating this purposeful, principled moral self. What are they?
They are virtue, practical wisdom, and goodwill.
Okay, let's break those down. Virtue.
Virtue in this context isn't just about being good in a general sense. It refers more to an all-around personal excellence, think competence, courage, integrity, fairness that is directed towards serving the collective good, not just self-interest. It's a stable state of character shown in how you think, feel, and act.
Right, a constellation of relevant excellences. What about practical wisdom?
Practical wisdom, or phronesis in Aristotle's terms, is seen as essential for actually exercising virtue effectively in the messy real world. It's about navigating complex situations, understanding context, making sound judgments, and finding the appropriate balance, the virtuous mean between extremes, avoiding vices like recklessness or cowardice. It requires discernment and experience.
The ability to apply virtue wisely.
And goodwill.
Goodwill, or eunoia, is that genuine, sincere care for the well-being and best interests of followers. It's the motivation that drives leaders to act in ways that truly benefit those they lead, not just manipulate them for personal gain. It signals that the leader has the followers' interests at heart. So virtue, wisdom, and goodwill. And these are conveyed through that leader enactment you mentioned.
Exactly. They're conveyed through consistent actions that reflect that virtuous balance, through demonstrating emotional control and thoughtful decision-making that signals practical wisdom, and through consistently choosing a behavioral style communication approachability that shows genuine care and consideration for followers. They also talk about something called the deep structure of leader choice. What does that mean?
That essentially refers to the underlying motivations that drive a leader's decisions and actions. Are those motivations primarily noble and focused on the greater good, or are they fundamentally self-serving and ignoble, even if masked by skillful rhetoric?
The why behind the what.
Precisely. From this perspective, a true leader of character is someone who consciously strives to align their own legitimate self-interests with the collective good, and who consistently acts based on deeply held intrinsic values and ethical principles, not just external pressures or rewards.
And ultimately, this concept of leader ethos connects back to the shared values and principles of the group or organization itself.
Yes. It establishes a kind of moral framework. When a leader consistently enacts virtue, wisdom, and goodwill, it resonates with the collective values and provides a basis for followers to interpret the leader's behavior positively and grant them credibility and trustworthiness. It builds that essential foundation of trust.
A very profound perspective. Okay, let's now turn our attention to the role of leader political skill in fostering team effectiveness, a topic explored by Darren C. Treadway and colleagues.
Yes, moving into the dynamics within teams.
The key insight here seems to be that leaders who possess political skill are better able to drive team effectiveness because they can positively influence those crucial team processes.
Right. But first, it's useful to remember the distinction they make between just general work groups and actual teams.
What's the difference again?
While both might work towards a common goal, True teams are characterized by a much higher degree of interdependent interaction among members. They rely on each other to get the work done. Teamwork involves a collaborative effort where the collective output is hopefully greater than just summing up individual contributions.
More synergy.
Exactly. And Treadway and his colleagues argue that the effectiveness of these interdependent teams is significantly shaped by the behaviors of leaders who possess this thing called political skill.
Okay, so what is political skill according to their model?
They define it, drawing on earlier work by Ferris and others, as a combination of four key facets. Social astuteness.
Meaning being good at reading people and situations.
Precisely, understanding social dynamics accurately. Second is networking ability building and effectively leveraging relationships and connections. Third is interpersonal influence, having that capacity to persuade and influence others without necessarily relying on formal authority.
Okay.
And the fourth, which is interesting, is apparent sincerity, the ability to project genuineness, authenticity, and trustworthiness in interactions. It appears sincere, whether it fully is or not is another question, but the appearance matters for influence.
So astuteness, networking, influence, and apparent sincerity. And they see this political skill as a kind of foundation.
Yes, they position it as a foundational prerequisite. Possessing political skill enables a leader to engage more effectively in specific leadership behaviors that then positively impact team processes.
What kinds of leader behaviors are driven by political skill?
They outline several. One critical area is setting goals. Politically skilled leaders are often better at understanding and interpreting the broader organizational expectations, and then using their social astuteness and influence skills to persuade team members to buy into and adopt challenging yet achievable goals.
Getting buy-in for tough goals. Makes sense. What else?
Supporting the team is another big one. This involves leveraging their networks and influence skills to secure the necessary resources for the team, whether that's information, funding, materials, or even getting the right people onto the team.
Fighting for resources.
Essentially, yes. Importantly, this resource provision doesn't just enable the work. It also signals the leader's commitment and support to the team, which can be a powerful motivator.
Okay, goals and support. What else?
Providing feedback effectively. Because politically skilled leaders often come across as more humble, affable, and trustworthy due to that apparent sincerity facet, they're generally better at delivering even critical feedback in a way that team members are more likely to accept constructively without getting overly defensive.
Delivering tough messages well.
Right. And this helps create a safer environment for accountability, both individual and mutual accountability within the team.
And they also mention managing conflict and effect, similar to Connolly's points.
Yes, there's overlap. Politically skilled leaders are often better at both preemptive conflict management, anticipating potential issues, and reactive management, stepping in effectively when disagreements arise. They're also typically better at regulating the emotional climate of the team, managing cohesion, frustration, excitement, etc., using their social skills.
So these leader behaviors, driven by political skill, then improve team processes, which leads to better outcomes.
That's the model. These positive leader behaviors foster healthier and more effective team processes, things like better communication, coordination, conflict resolution, mutual support, and these improved processes ultimately lead to desirable team outcomes across several dimensions.
What kinds of outcomes?
They categorize them into three types. First, effective outcomes, things like team members feeling supported by their leader, believing in the team's long-term viability or sustainability, and overall job satisfaction within the team.
The feel-good factors.
Essentially, yes. Second, behavioral outcomes. This includes not just strong performance on the core tasks the team is responsible for, but also enhanced contextual performance team members, going above and beyond their basic duties to support each other and the broader organizational environment. OCB's organizational citizenship behaviors.
Going the extra mile.
Exactly. And third, cognitive outcomes. A key one here is team adaptation. The team's ability to be flexible, learn, and respond effectively to changes or challenges in their environment, which is obviously crucial today.
So political skill fuels behaviors that drive processes that lead to better feelings, better actions, and better thinking in teams.
That's a concise way to put their argument, yes.
Okay, shifting gears once more. Viviane Seranian offers a fascinating perspective on how leaders use communication specifically to drive social change. She calls it social identity framing.
Yes, this focuses very much on the persuasive power of language, tie to group identity.
The core idea here, as I understand it, is that leaders can effectively gain support for their vision of change by communicating in ways that resonate with and maybe even reshape the group's shared sense of their social identity.
Exactly. It involves leaders strategically using language, rhetoric, symbols, and stories that specifically reference and appeal to the group's collective identity, their shared values, history, beliefs, common fate, in order to build support for a proposed change or vision. It's about making the change feel consistent with who we are as a group.
She outlines a kind of three-phase sequence for this, drawing on Lewin's classic change model, unfreezing, moving, refreezing, and looks at the communication tactics used in each phase.
That's right. Based on studies, including analyses of presidential speeches, she suggests a pattern. In the initial unfreezing phase, where the goal is often to create readiness for change, the communication tends to emphasize the leader's similarity to the followers. Using familiar language, maybe a more leveling tone, humor tactics that build connection and trust.
Establishing common ground first, then the moving phase.
In the moving phase, where the change itself is being advocated and implemented, there's often a noticeable increase in the use of negation, perhaps highlighting what needs to be rejected or left behind from the old way. And the language tends to become increasingly active and tangible, painting a clearer, more concrete picture of the desired future state. Less abstract, more action-oriented.
Making the future real. And the final refreezing phase.
In the refreezing phase, where the aim is to solidify the change and the new identity, this active and tangible language often continues. But there's also typically a greater use of inclusive language. Lots of we, us, our, reinforcing the shared identity. And maybe less reliance on purely abstract or conceptual language, more focus on shared experiences or symbols.
So across these phases, the specific communication tactics employed are essentially creating distinct frames
Exact.
that subtly but powerfully shift how the group sees itself, its boundaries, its values, making them more receptive to the leader's vision for change.
That's the core mechanism of social identity framing. It works by altering the very definition of the in-group in a way that aligns with the leader's goals.
And Saranian also highlights that it's not just what is said, but how it's delivered.
Critically important. She emphasizes that strong message delivery, things like confident body language, vocal fluency, and variety, good eye contact, appropriate speaking speed, emotional expressiveness, significantly enhances the effectiveness of this framing process.
Why is delivery so important?
Well, conversely, a weak or hesitant delivery can actually undermine the whole effort. It might violate followers' implicit expectations or prototypes of how a leader should communicate, making the leader seem less credible. It can also simply distract the audience from the message itself.
Whereas strong delivery.
Strong, compelling delivery can act as a powerful heuristic cue. It signals confidence, conviction, and credibility. Even if listeners aren't analyzing every word, the confident delivery can enhance the perceived trustworthiness of the leader and make the message itself seem more persuasive. It adds weight to the framing.
Delivery reinforces the message. Makes sense. Finally, let's delve into something really practical. How leaders can strategically use the science of memory to make their communications stick. Jay Conger explored this.
Yes, a very pragmatic piece.
The central insight here seems to be that in our age of information overload, leaders need to be much more intentional about understanding how memory works to ensure their key messages actually get retained and acted upon.
Absolutely. Conger argues that a crucial, maybe often overlooked, role of a leader is to make activity meaningful through communication. But for communication to be meaningful over the long term, it has to be remembered. This is essential for influencing motivation, guiding decisions, shaping identities, all core leadership functions.
And the challenge is bigger now.
Definitely. With the sheer volume of information bombarding people, plus the rise of geographically dispersed teams relying on virtual communication, just getting a message heard isn't enough. You have to fight for retention.
He points out the well-known limitations of our working memory, right? George Miller's old 7 plus or minus 2 idea.
Yes, the classic finding that our short-term memory, the mental workspace where we actively process information, has a pretty limited capacity. We can only juggle a small number of items at once, maybe for only 15-30 seconds if we don't rehearse them, and it's incredibly susceptible to interruption and distraction.
And the implication for leaders is?
The stark implication is that a substantial portion of what they communicate, no matter how well-crafted or important they think it is, might simply be lost. It evaporates from working memory before it has a chance to be encoded into long-term memory.
So what can leaders do? How do we make things stick?
Well, repetition is absolutely fundamental. We know this intuitively, but Conger specifically highlights the effectiveness of spaced repetition.
Spaced repetition. Meaning,
Instead of just repeating something many times in one go, massed repetition, spaced repetition involves revisiting the key information or message at increasing intervals over time, say after an hour, then a day, then a week, then a month. This method appears to significantly strengthen long-term memory retention compared to cramming.
why does that work?
He touches upon the utility model of memory, which is one possible explanation. It suggests our brains implicitly prioritize remembering information that we encounter repeatedly over time, especially if it seems useful or relevant to our ongoing tasks. Consistent spaced repetition basically signals to the brain, hey, this is important, keep it accessible.
He gives the Ritz-Carlton example, doesn't he?
Yes. Horst Schultz, the co-founder, apparently made a point of constantly repeating the company's core motto and service values at every opportunity, day after day. It wasn't just said once during orientation. It was drilled in through spaced repetition until it became deeply ingrained in the culture.
So repetition is key. What else? Stories.
Stories. Conger emphasizes the remarkable power of using narrative in leader communications. Research on how we process stories shows they are far more memorable, engaging, and persuasive than simply presenting lists of facts, data points, or abstract concepts.
Why are stories so sticky?
They engage us emotionally, they provide context, they often illustrate cause and effect, they create mental imagery, they tap into how our brains are naturally wired to make sense of the world. He shares the famous anecdote about Herb Kelleher, the co-founder of Southwest Airlines.
The story
About how someone asked him how Southwest maintained its unique culture. And instead of giving a complex management theory answer, Kelleher told a simple story about how they hired people with the right attitude first. That single story vividly illustrated a core, complex principle, the ongoing effort needed to build and sustain culture in a way that was instantly understandable and highly memorable.
So use spaced repetition for key messages and embed them in stories.
That seems to be the practical takeaway for making leadership communication much more memorable and impactful.
Okay, so we've explored what these interpersonal and influence skills are in quite some detail, and we've definitely established why they're so critical for effective leadership. Now we arrive at the really crucial question. How can leaders actually go about developing and strengthening these essential competencies? This is where the rubber meets the road.
Absolutely. And several of our sources offer concrete insights here. Craig R. Seal and his colleagues, for instance, propose a model specifically focused on responsible leadership development, often in a university context.
Responsible leadership development.
Yes. In their model, the cultivation of social and emotional competencies, things like self-awareness, empathy, relationship management, plays a pivotal role. These competencies act almost like moderators, influencing how effectively a leader's emerging sense of identity translates into actual, tangible leadership effectiveness.
So the competencies help bridge identity and impact.
Exactly. Their model also draws heavily on insights from student success literature, emphasizing things like self-discovery, building self-awareness, fostering self-efficacy, and it's grounded in this quite democratic belief that leadership potential isn't confined to a select few, but exists within everyone and can be developed.
What's their recommended focus for development? Where should people start?
Based on their observations, particularly with college students, they suggest a preferred sequence. Start by building self-awareness and a genuine consideration for others, focusing on the knowledge and understanding dimensions first. Then, progressively move towards developing stronger behavioral skills related to connection and influence.
Build the foundation first.
Kind of. They also highlight two key mechanisms for driving this development. Encouraging thoughtful reflection on past social and emotional experiences, learning from successes and failures, and utilizing peer coaching, where individuals support and challenge each other's growth.
Reflection and peer support. Makes sense.
And then, of course, you have Boyatzi's and McKee's well-regarded intentional change process, which offers a very structured approach to personal development.
Can you quickly recap those steps?
Sure. It involves 5 key discoveries or phases. First, clearly envisioning your ideal self, who you aspire to be as a leader. Second, gaining an accurate understanding of your real self, your current strengths and weaknesses, often through feedback. Third, developing a specific actionable learning agenda to bridge the gap between the real and ideal. Fourth, actively experimenting with new behaviors and deliberately practicing the desired skills in real-world situations. And fifth, critically, cultivating resonant, supportive relationships, coaches, mentors, peers who can help you sustain the effort.
That sounds quite comprehensive. They also talk about the PEA and NEA.
Yes, the positive emotional attractor, PEA, and the negative emotional attractor, NEA. This is central to their intentional change theory. The basic idea is that thinking about our hopes, dreams, and ideal self activates the PEA, which is linked to the parasympathetic nervous system, creating feelings of optimism, hope, and openness to learning. This state makes change feel possible and desirable.
And the NEA.
The negative emotional attractor gets activated when we focus on problems, weaknesses, external expectations, or threats. This engages the sympathetic nervous system, the stress response leading to feelings of anxiety, defensiveness, and a tendency to shut down or resist change. So, for sustainable development, they argue you need to primarily engage the MEA. Keep the focus on the positive vision and possibilities.
Focus on the dream, not just the gap.
Essentially, yes. While acknowledging the real self is necessary, dwelling on the negative gap can be counterproductive. Actively engaging the PEA is key for fostering the motivation and resilience needed for lasting change.
And the Weatherhead School's approach we discussed earlier seems to embody these principles.
It really does. Their competency development process includes having students create a personal vision, engaging the PEA, getting that multi-source feedback via the ESCIU to understand their real self, using tools like personal balance sheets to analyze strengths and gaps, and then crafting those detailed learning agendas.
And they emphasize practice in daily life.
Yes, interestingly, they stress the importance of actively leveraging everyday experiences and interactions, meetings, conversations, projects, as the primary laboratory for practice, rather than relying solely on special courses or isolated training workshops. Learning in the flow of work and life.
That seems more sustainable. Susan Elaine Murphy and her colleagues also looked at soft skills training more broadly.
Yes, they provide valuable insights into how this training is happening across both business and, importantly, technical fields. They really underscore the growing demand for these interpersonal skills.
Why the increased demand?
Several factors. The ongoing shift towards service-oriented economies, the increasing diversity within workforces requiring better cross-cultural communication and understanding, and the general forces of globalization making collaboration across boundaries essential. Together, these create a very strong business case for investing in these skills.
They talk about common methods used.
Yes, things we've touched on, 360-degree feedback processes, are very common for raising self-awareness, as are structured leadership development programs that often include modules on communication, conflict resolution, team building, and influence.
Do they offer examples of best practices?
They do. They look at programs from leading training organizations and highlight common elements, focusing on which specific skills are taught, the how, the teaching methods used, often experiential, and importantly, the evidence. What proof exists that these programs actually lead to tangible behavioral change and improved performance.
It's encouraging, too, as you mentioned, that even traditionally hard skill fields like engineering and medicine are really embracing this now.
Absolutely. Accreditation standards for engineering programs, for instance, now often explicitly require demonstrated competence in areas like teamwork and communication. Medical schools are increasingly incorporating training on empathy, communicating effectively with diverse patient populations, and interprofessional teamwork right into their core curricula. There are specific examples cited from universities actively doing this.
And leading business schools are doing this, too.
Definitely. Top undergraduate business schools are actively integrating soft skills development. This isn't just an afterthought anymore. It's happening through required courses, dedicated leadership centers, specialized minors or concentrations, experiential programs, and leadership fellowships. Examples from Wharton, Stern, McIntyre, Cornell, and others show this is becoming mainstream.
So the message seems to be getting through, that technical skills alone aren't enough.
It really does seem so. There's a growing and widespread recognition from educators and employers alike that strong technical abilities need to be complemented by well-developed interpersonal and influence skills for graduates to truly succeed and thrive in today's complex, collaborative, and constantly changing work environments.
Colleges and universities seem to be stepping up to meet that need.
They increasingly are, developing a really wide array of both curricular and co-curricular initiatives specifically designed to cultivate and enhance these crucial interpersonal abilities in their students before they even enter the workforce.
So, as we bring this really comprehensive deep dive to a close, it feels abundantly clear, doesn't it? Interpersonal and influence skills are not by any stretch the soft or optional side of leadership.
Not at all. They are fundamental. They are core drivers of actual effectiveness.
And they encompass this incredibly rich tapestry of abilities, everything from emotional intelligence and sophisticated social skills, right through to nuanced communication techniques and even political savvy.
And perhaps the most crucial takeaway, the most empowering one, is that these are not fixed innate traits that some people are just lucky enough to be born with.
Right. That's key.
They are competencies. They can be actively learned, they can be deliberately cultivated, and they can be continuously honed and improved through focused effort, through thoughtful self-reflection, and through consistent, intentional practice in real-world situations.
And it feels like in today's world, so intricate, so interconnected globally, where effective collaboration, clear communication, and the ability to genuinely influence others are just paramount for achieving anything significant.
Absolutely.
These interpersonal and influence skills are only going to become more significant, more critical for leaders at every single level across every industry.
Couldn't agree more. Which brings us perhaps to a crucial point for you, our listener, to consider as you process all of this.
Yeah, a final thought to take away.
Reflecting on this diverse range of interpersonal and influence skills we've unpacked today, from emotional control and empathy to political skill and storytelling, which specific areas, maybe just one or two, really resonated most strongly with your own professional experiences? Or perhaps eliminated some current challenges you're navigating right now?
Making it personal.
Exactly. And then maybe ask yourself, what is one small, concrete, intentional step? Just one thing that you could realistically commit to taking, perhaps even this week, to begin to further develop your proficiency in one of those particular areas.
Just one small step.
Just one small step. Maybe revisiting your own experiences or even some of your own sources or past feedback with these insights and frameworks in mind could spark some fresh ideas for exploration and deliberate growth.